Hello and welcome back to the Comic Lounge. Today's episode was a video that I teased last week, which is me actually talking about storylines. And what I have for you is at least 3 storylines, and I feel these are all bangers. And the last storyline is obviously the reason why I just shortened this to 3 storylines, or at least 3 to talk about, because the last one is probably the most slept on storyline. While yes, when it comes to the character, it will get talked about, but when it comes to this particular character and the storylines, this one technically does take a back seat. But for me, I feel like it's criminally underrated, and it's such a crazy storyline that it needs to be talked about. So, and I feel like it definitely does. So, without further ado, I will see you all after this. The first storyline that I have lined up is for a character that, due to the over-the-topness when it comes to this character, yes, there will be some infusion from like horror, science fiction, and of course, most times, action. There might be a bit of thrills in some of this, stuff that kind of borders on being thriller. There is at least a bit of a overcall sort of compensation, whatever, of at least various type of genres. But this one is, I think, the definitive horror themed story for this character. Now, this character, of course, by today's standards, would seem kind of politically incorrect because of given what the character is and the profession, which is being a police officer, and knowing that today how we kind of view police officers these days, and feel like that any sort of media that tries to sanitize characters seem like might be considered the term propaganda. But given the fact that these storylines are so over the top and it's almost satirical, that I think for some people he does get a pass. Because again, it's just a complete over the top world that the character lives in. It's such a more of a fantasy, so in a way, it works. And I think for this particular story, this, I think, is one that should always be checked out. And what I'm talking about is, well, Judge Dredd, with issue number 3 from Law of Dredd, which is technically the second reprint for this particular story, because this, again, is a reprint of Judge Dredd number 3 from, 1985, which pretty much compiles the 5-part storyline that pretty much introduced to the world the Dark Judges. Not just Judge Death. Judge Death came a lot more earlier. But by 1981, they introduced the Dark Judges, and that being writers John Wagner and Alan Grant, who of course would go on to do some exceptional work for DC Comics, coming up with some iconic characters for both Batman, and of course Alan Grant would go on to reinvent the character Lobo, who of course is getting a lot of popularity due to James Gunn now. But this is some early Alan Grant and John Wagner, and also some early work from artist Brian Bolland. And this story for early 80s, definitely during the period of the Bronze Age, at least the end of the Bronze Age, is probably one of the most bonkers Bronze Age stories you'll ever get, and it came out in the UK. And because since the UK really wasn't confined to the Comics Code Authority, I believe they weren't, because that was something I think for the US than really for the UK, but there might have been. Still, the UK were so unforgiving when it comes to their storyline that they were allowed to really go in places that some weren't really allowed to, which is why a lot of those writers and artists from the UK, when they came to the US to at least draw or write whatever for Marvel and DC, they always, especially DC Comics, is really you got more of their flair, their sort of artistic ideas, and it was always going to be a lot more crazier, more wild. That's why Alan Moore, for example. But Alan Grant and John Wagner really pushed things too, and this is one of those. It is a crazy story. There's a lot of horror elements in this one, besides just being, the Dark Judges, but it is so out there. It's so over the top, yet it's so good at the same time. This should not be slept on anyways. I don't know if it does get slept on, but when it comes to Judge Dredd, this is probably one of the most popular stories. But still, for those that do tend to go through books, I feel like Judge Dredd does get a little bit kind of lowered a bit. He doesn't seem to get as much attention. But back then, when Judge Dredd was such a hot character, yeah, this is definitely one of the ones you really had to at least have a copy of. So this is a cheap copy to begin with. This is the reprint under the Law of Dread, which again always compiled the same exact stories, same stuff from the first American series, but still these were all originally printed as at least stories in the newspaper magazines in the UK, which originally were all black and white, but for the comics here in the US, they all got colored. So it's still, you get some great artwork from a lot of great artists. So this as being all Brian Boland, this should not be slept on. It's a very, very cool storyline. I loved it. And again, this just really is just, at times it's fairly brutal and uncompromising for something from like the early 80s. But since this was the UK, it was such a completely different ball game in that part of the country, in the UK. So you always got a lot more crazy, just like with movies. You always would get something crazier in Europe than here in the US. So always, definitely check out. This is definitely worth grabbing. Again, you can find this for $2 to $3. I think the original print under Judge Dredd should at least still be well around $10 to $15 maybe. At least maybe $5. It shouldn't cost you an arm and a leg. They're very cheap. So, and again, it compiles all the 5 stories, all the 5 parts. So, it into one comic. It should not be that difficult. So, at least go for that. Alright, so the next character is actually one who's actually done a crossover with Judge Dredd. And when it comes to this particular popular character, since I mentioned him already, Alan Grant has written for this character. John Wagner has definitely written for this character. And has introduced, the ventriloquist / Scarface, and so you should know which character this is. When it comes to a lot of the horror stuff that you got out of this character from the 70s and throughout into modern day, that there's a lot more other stories that obviously, overshadows this, because this was more part of the actual comic series and not like graphic novels. And a lot of graphic novels for this, like Batman, a cult, or was it Batman Cult or a cult, whatever it was referred to? You had that. There was a lot of also vampire-based stories. There's a whole bunch of horror stories you got out of this character, but it came to his series that were printed for like detective to this. Some of them don't get mentioned too often, but I think this one is, a hidden gem when it comes to the stories that were printed within Detective of Batman. And this one actually was a 2-parter that started from Detective Comics 6, was it 565, to, of course, here, Batman 399. And, of course, the cover for Detective Comics 565, as you'll see, I think it was drawn by either Gene Colan or Ernie Colan. I think it was Gene Colan that drew that one. But for this one, for Batman 399, the second and final part in this, what I would describe as a EC comic storyline, something you would get out of like a crime suspense or shock suspense, let alone a Tales from the Crypt story that got infused into a Batman continuity. And again, this cover was drawn by Tom Mandrake, and it's probably the most infamous of some of these Batman covers because of how grim and macabre this comes across. This is why this is a typical Tales from the Crypt comic book cover. It has got that bleakness to it, and it's what makes it one of the more unique Batman covers. But this, again, was a 2-part storyline that pretty much saw Batman going after a psychotic jilted lover, who of course is killing people, let's say was his girls or girlfriends that have rejected him. So he is of course killing them, and the first girl that I think he had killed, well, they discover her severed head is what it is. They discover her severed head, and Batman has to figure out who it is, and they eventually find out. And of course, helping him is Catwoman, since they're still going along with the relationship. I think this one kind of is the beginning of ending that relationship, and then we're getting close to that again. This is post-Crisis on Infinite Earths. So, still for post-Crisis, they're still trying to go for the storyline. But again, Doug Mensch, who of course I believe is both the writer and Detective Comics 565 in here. Of course, this one, it's definitely a story. And again, this is bordering on a slasher film. There's a lot of was it like crime thrillers sort of storyline. This is almost like something you'd expect from Italian giallo story, like a Dario Argento, like some of his early works. It got me bordering on that, and it's really something to see that, or Brian De Palma or whatever. It's a really I'd say it's an underrated story, and it really is perfect for the October Halloween period. And again, Batman can work great as a horror movie, and this is one of those I feel like would have to be a straight-up horror movie. This is pretty much, again, it's really bonkers, it's crazy, it's insane, and I love it. So do not snooze on this one. Again, you can find these fairly cheap, Detective Comics 565 and Batman 399. Because I think there are some collected editions that might include this, but somehow some of these are not probably fully collected, so who knows. But this again is actually a fourth printing for the comic. Still, you should be able to find this no less, and eventually I'll probably want to upgrade to begin with. I've had this for a long time, so still, this is definitely worth looking for. I definitely recommend this comic. It's really something. Again, talk about some great cover for the period too, man. Tom Mandrake, another killer, underrated artist. Very much awesome there. Finally, the last storyline is for a character that normally not always ventured into the horror, but when he did, it was either going to be interesting or at times kind of... Now, I know Garth Ennis would actually write a couple horror-based storylines for this character during his run for the character in the 2000s, but earlier you really didn't get a lot of horror stories out of this character, but when you did, it was either going to be kind of okayish in an annual, but this one was for a 4-part graphic novel story, and this is a crazy, crazy story, and I think is also very underrated, and I feel kind of, let's just put it this way, I was kind of hesitant on throwing the story in here because I haven't completely read the entire story, but I have gotten the premise of it, and I am looking for the last 2 parts in this, but I've got the first 2 parts, picked this up a year ago, and again, each for $5, but I have to, because off the premise and what I have read so far, this is, I think, the most underrated horror story for the Punisher. And again, it's written by Jim Starlin and drawn by the late Bernie Wrightson. It is Punisher P.O.V. And this is, I think, the definitive horror Punisher storyline. The whole premise of the storyline is that there is a particular criminal. I think he was like a thief or something. He obviously tries to rob I think it's some sort of plant. As he gets out of prison, he tries to rob a plant. But the plant somehow gets triggered. Some sort of explosive, I think, triggers it, whatever. It all goes up in flames, and he gets caught into it. And he gets burnt. I think his friend ends up getting killed in it that helped him get out of prison or whatever. I think he was let go, but he starts to redo it and gets reacquainted with the guy. But again, he gets burnt by during the operation. And it was just a complete crap shoot. You know, it was a complete fail. But he gets burnt from it, and from hiding from the authorities and so on, he goes into the sewers, Well, that turned out to be a bad idea because some sort of toxic waste, or at least it's said to be toxic waste until by I think the second the part in the story it gets explained what this dump whatever that gets dumped into the sewer. It pretty much, of course, engulfs our criminal here, and well, we then start venturing into body horror elements because he starts mutating by this West whatever, and whatever was in there is obviously responsible of someone very popular within the Marvel Comics universe, and it is just insane. But he starts going around killing people, whatever. But yet at the same time, Punisher's also pursuing a killer who is somehow they're confusing for our criminal here, who's pretty much mutating by the minute into like this grotesque freaking monster by the end of the story. He's basically unrecognizable, and almost at times kind of remind me of the Thing. You know, John Carpenter's The Thing, and there's another person going around killing people, and turns out it's some crazed psychopath who thinks he's a monster hunter. And in his mind, he thinks he's killing monsters. He killed his own mother, actually, in the story, who he thought was a freaking werewolf. So he kills her and is going around killing people because he thinks that there's a whole bunch of monsters and everything running around. But again, what he's actually doing is that he's killing other people. He's like a psychotic guy. And they're confusing these murders for our criminal here, who's mutating into a grotesque monster. And on top of that, this criminal had connections to Kingpin. And since Kingpin wants to find out what's going on, he decides to get Punisher to help him. And so technically Punisher ends up working with Kingpin to find our criminal, who is just mutating by the story. You know, he's mutating. And it is just insane. The whole thing is crazy, and the fact that we got Frank Castle battling this grotesque humanoid this person is crazy. I mean, it probably took a little inspiration from one of the annuals. Was it the Life Force? But I think this has been fleshed out so much better. It's so much more interesting. And again, it's Jim Starlin, and it's also the late artist Bernie Wrightson, and they obviously craft one of the most bonkers. And by here, you kind of see this is technically our criminal here. And the thing is, you kind of see, even though he's looking a little burnt, but you can see there's a bit of a change going on. And in this one, there is at least a panel, whatever, in the book that kind of, resembles this cover. And it's great. Eventually, I got to track down the last two parts, because eventually I will read again its entire story. But this is one to not snooze on. If you want a horror story that has the Punisher, this is one to look for. You can at least find these for fairly cheap. This shouldn't cost you an arm and a leg. At least maybe $20 maybe for all 5. Maybe possibly 30 depending. But still, it shouldn't cost you no less for at least for any of these $5 or $10. So don't snooze on Punisher P.O.V. Do not. It is worth checking out. It is a very criminally underrated Punisher story that ventures into body horror. And it has a secondary sort of plot going on that's just as crazy as the other. So it's really an insane storyline from the cosmic writer that is Jim Starlin. So yeah, this is during the time he's kind of building towards the Infinity Gauntlet. But here he crafted, I think, one of the most underrated horror stories for Marvel Comics. So really, check out Punisher P.O.V. Check out any of these 3 storylines. So there you have it. If you have any other stories that you have read that you would like to recommend me that are in these vein, or at least just as maybe even better than some of these stories, leave them all that in the comment section below. But until then, if I'm back by Halloween, I'll see you then. But until then, I hope all of you have at least a great Halloween. So take care, everyone.